You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This is Michael Medved. Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, once said that God offers special protection to drunkards, lost dogs, children, and the United States of America. We'll explore that special protection and what it means in The American Miracle. Subscribe to The American Miracle on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, the Fall of France to the Meuse. This week, a big thank you goes out to Yaroslav, Michelle, James, Linda, Sanford, Wallace, and Stefan for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. You can find out more about supporting the show over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. As a reminder, there are new monthly member-only episodes being released, with the most recent member episode being a biography of Hermann Goering from his early life until he became president of the Reichstag late in 1932. You can find out more about all of the new member episodes and future plans for the podcast in a link in the show notes, or again at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. For the German forces under Army Group A, the period between May 11th and the 13th would be just as critical as the first day of the attack. It would be over the course of those 2 days when they would make their approach to the Meuse River, which they hoped to cross before the French really understood what was happening. To do this, they needed to advance quickly, pushing through any delaying forces that were in their way. This would then set them up to cross the river at a handful of different points on the 13th, after which they could continue their advance. Speed was important to prevent the French from bringing forces to defend the river crossings, but for the French to do so, they would need to understand what was happening and react in time. This reaction would not occur, and therefore the French defenses and the defending troops that had been put in place before May 10th were critical if they wanted to stop the Germans. Both of these topics will be discussed in this episode, which will set us up to discuss the crossing of the Meuse next episode, with the crossing of the river being one of the pivotal moments of the war up to this point. The speed with which the armored and motorized forces under the German generals could reach the Meuse River at Sedan and other places was a critical marker of success and failure for the German offensive. They had to move quickly through the Ardennes bottleneck and get across the Meuse and into open country as quickly as possible to make it more difficult for the French to react. This was always going to be a challenge, and during the first few days of the offensive, the heroes that rose to meet that challenge were the engineers of the various mechanized units that were trying to make that advance. They were everywhere throughout the Ardennes during these days, removing anti-tank obstacles that were put in place by the Belgians, clearing obstacles that were blocking roads, and most importantly, rapidly replacing bridges and fixing crossings across various water obstacles. They would work closely with the units that had been assigned to be traffic police throughout the German advance, which were just as critical to the advance. These traffic police would not just monitor traffic, but they were constantly trying to find alternative routes for some units based on traffic jams or change in plans or obstacles that were unexpected. These tasks would have been challenging under the absolute best of circumstances, but war is rarely the best of circumstances. The situation was made even worse when Guderian, already frustrated with how slow things were moving, thought he saw an opportunity that required a slight reorganization of his forces. The units of the 1st Panzer Division were involved in fighting at various points during the day, and the 10th Panzer was also engaged but less frequently. During the day on May 10th, Guderian decided that there might be an opportunity for some of the units of the 10th Panzer to change their direction and move through an area which was previously not assigned to a German armored unit. He would ask General von Kleist, Guderian's immediate superior, if he could take some of his southern units of the 10th Panzer and move them north to attack on the other side of the division. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a reasonable change, just moving units to try and take advantage of an enemy weakness. That's what the Germans like to do. But in the confined areas of the Ardennes, with only so many roads, it was a major headache for the traffic police, and they had to suddenly find space for hundreds of vehicles moving in kind of the wrong direction. This movement, which would occur on the 11th of May, would just exacerbate some of the traffic problems that had already caused the panzer divisions to miss their objectives on the first day of the attack. Another major problem, which would continue into the 11th, was some of the stubborn rearguard actions of French and Belgian forces throughout the area. These were never structured in a way that could permanently halt the German attack, but in the confined areas where flanking options were often limited, it could certainly slow the forwardmost units down in ways that were honestly just really annoying. Of course, the French and Belgians knew that none of these small blocking forces could prevent the German advance, and so they were already prepared to retreat in various areas. One of the units involved in these delaying actions was the French 5th Light Cavalry Division, which would be retreating back across the Semois River, where they planned to mount a serious defense. The Semois was called a river, but in many areas in this part of its course, it was not very deep or wide, and so its ability to halt the German advance was really quite a bit less than it was on other areas of the river. But the 5th Light Cavalry hoped that it could at least help anchor their lines and give them a better chance. They would face the 1st Panzer Division, which was by far the forwardmost panzer division at this time, being one of the few large mobile units to meet its objectives on the 11th of May, which was to reach the Semois. This achievement would be represented in the divisional diary for the 11th, which would read, quote, "A feeling of superiority over our Western opponents arose in the division on this day, a day in which it encountered for the first time French forces along the 2nd Belgian resistance line. The division has reached its goals planned for it on the second day, far in advance of its sister divisions, without regard for its flanks and in spite of the slow progress of the day before." End quote. At this time, it would really just be the forwardmost units that would even see the French or Belgians, and the vast majority of the men of the German divisions were really not doing anything but marching on these 2 days. For the troops that were at the front, a great example of some of the fighting that would occur on this area of the front would be at the small city of Bouillon at a crossing of the Semois River. On this particular area was the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Panzer Companies of the 1st Panzer Division. They were far ahead of any kind of infantry support, but they were continuing to push forward into the outskirts of the town. They would make it across the river over 2 bridges, with the 2nd and 4th Companies actually making it across, but this would prove to only be partially good news. At the exact moment that they got across, 20 German bombers attacked and launched their bombs against the German tanks, having mistaken them for French tanks. These bombs were then joined by French artillery, which would force the 3rd and 4th Companies to retreat, mostly due to the fact that they were not joined by their infantry, and they were finding it difficult to make progress through the city anyway, and then all these explosions started happening. The 2nd Company held on a little bit longer, but they were also forced to retreat back across the river, giving up their gains from their previous efforts. This is a great example of how, no matter how good the German tanks were, no matter how good they were at working together, sometimes they just needed infantry to make their attack successful. Another German attack was planned for the next morning, with far greater support for the tank units. However, the previous evening, believing that they'd done their job, the French defenders instead decided to voluntarily withdraw from their positions. This meant that the German attack the next day fell on a Bouillon with no French troops inside of it. This is an interesting example, again, of the French having postponed the German advance and then pulling back, according to plan, perfectly as they were supposed to. But the capture of Bouillon, along with the capture of several other crossings over the Semois, would set up Guderian's panzer units for the next phase of the campaign, the advance from the Semois to the Meuse. This phase of the advance would be relatively easy, with the terrain not really supporting a stringent defense, and the French units in the area mostly just wanting to retreat across the Meuse as quickly as possible to set up defensive lines along the river to prevent a German crossing. While the news from the Semois was encouraging, during the day on May 11th, there were also encouraging reports reaching German high command that the French were not reacting in any major way to the German advance through the Ardennes, with there being few reports of serious French rail activity behind the front, which meant that they could not move large units to block the German advance, or at least they weren't moving them on the 11th. That did not mean that there was not resistance from French units all along the front, though, as there were a few areas, even between the Semois and the Meuse, where French resistance was actually quite firm. Often these were based around specific blockhouses and pillboxes that had been built in this area to defend against the exact type of German attack that was happening. These were generally positioned a few kilometers to the east of the Meuse and were positioned to try and slow the German advance to the river. One of these was about 3 kilometers north of the village of Saint-Meuse. This blockhouse was disguised as a simple forest home, and it would take several hours for the German attack to push through the French defenses. Another pillbox was located nearby, and this one had an anti-tank gun to go along with its machine guns. The troops in this area had also been able to plant some mines, which meant that they had some defenses at some critical points that further strengthened their defense. There would be multiple attacks on this specific set of pillboxes over the course of May 12th without much success, and it was only when a German tank got to point-blank range with the French pillbox and was able to fire directly into it at the French defenders that they were finally overcome. In all cases, the problem with these smaller defenses is that they were always overwhelmed by superior German forces at some point. Sometimes it took longer, sometimes it took shorter, and it was really just a matter of how long they could delay the Germans in their advance. But that did not prevent them from causing serious headaches for the German forces that were tasked with subduing them, a task that would take a good portion of May 12th. While the 1st Panzer Division was pushing ahead of most other units, in the trail behind them was a mass of German units all trying to push forward as quickly as possible. None of these desired an open road more than the units of the 6th and 8th Panzer Divisions, which were part of the Panzer Corps commanded by General Reinhardt. Reinhardt's corps was always going to have a hard time getting through the Ardennes because it was echeloned behind the troops of Guderian's corps, strictly due to the limited roads in the area and the fact that Guderian had priority. But after the first 2 days of the attack, they were finally starting to break free, which then immediately led them into having to contend with enemy troops and various obstacles. Reinhardt's corps would be to the north of the 2nd Panzer Division, which was immediately north of the 1st Panzer Division, and the 2nd Panzer Division was making its way towards Meuse, which would be a Belgian city on the Semois where it hoped to capture a bridge to cross the river. Obviously, capturing a bridge is always important, but the bridge at Meuse was particularly important for a reason that the Germans did not fully understand. This specific area of the front was the boundary between the French 2nd and 9th armies, with such boundaries always being a point of weakness for an army. This meant that when the troops of the 1st Panzer Brigade of the 2nd Panzer Division crossed the river, they were moving into an area of specific weakness for the French army. All along the front, by the end of May 12th, essentially all of the French defenders to the east of the Meuse were already moving back across the river, or they were on their way to do so. But by the evening of that day, the German forces all along Guderian's front were either at the river or getting close, and the French would destroy the bridges across the Meuse before the Germans could use them. The speed of this advance had completely defied expectations, with even many of the German commanders not believing that the Meuse could be reached so quickly, with the 1st Panzer Division having reached it, which meant a 115 kilometer advance, in just 2 days. I feel like it's worth repeating and re-emphasizing that even on the German side, this speed was not expected by anybody who was not a leader of Panzer Divisions or Panzer Corps. Sure, Guderian and Reinhardt and Rommel and those type of generals believed that things like this were possible, but most German leaders did not. Halder, the chief of the German General Staff, believed that the crossing of the Meuse would only occur on the 9th day of the offensive, and now it was scheduled to maybe happen on the 3rd, and the French were, of course, equally surprised. Speaking of General Rommel, the forces under Guderian were not the only German forces pushing for the Meuse as quickly as possible. To their north, the 2 Panzer Divisions of Panzer Corps Hoth were doing exactly the same thing. The 5th Panzer Division was commanded by General Hartlieb, while the 7th Panzer Division was commanded by General Erwin Rommel, destined for fame in North Africa. In many ways, their actions did not look meaningfully different than what was happening further south. They were moving through a different area of the Ardennes, but they were facing similar terrain and similar French and Belgian attacks. In one interesting event, a French engineering company were sent to demolish a bridge over a river, which it was hoped that the Belgians would do, but their demolition charges didn't get the job done, and so this required the French unit to move up. But then they had to wait for the bridge to be clear of Belgian refugees that were streaming across. They did manage to get it destroyed, just as the Germans were arriving, and then they made the mistake of retreating from the bridge without trying to defend it at all. This allowed the German pioneer units to quickly build another bridge, or at least repair the bridge, and bring it back into action and continue the advance, with the total delay only being a couple of hours to repair this bridge, and it could have been so much longer even with a rudimentary French defense. This is a good example of how it could sometimes be difficult for the French forces to both retreat fast enough to keep ahead of the Germans while also doing the things required to really slow the Germans down. It was a very difficult thing to balance, and it varied by area and circumstance. There were a lot of variables to keep track of. Another thing that was difficult for the French to react to was just the constant sort of movement of the German forces. For example, the advance of the 7th Panzer, which would be the first time that Rommel would command such a large unit in combat, would kind of showcase the hallmarks of his later style in North Africa, the incredible emphasis on constantly moving forward, ignoring everything else around him, just push, push, push. After the very first day of fighting, he would write, quote, "Again and again, that in encounter actions, the day goes to the side that is the first to plaster its opponents with fire. The man who lies low and awaits developments usually comes off second best." End quote. While Rommel would do quite well in his position throughout the campaign, it is interesting to compare his command style to those of other German divisional leaders. He had no experience commanding armored forces, but his natural style was already just kind of go, go, go as quickly as possible, and to keep moving from objective to objective, which was kind of the correct way to command an armored division when facing the French army that was having trouble reacting to such moves. The objective of Panzer Group Hoth was the same as Panzer Group Kleist to its south, advance to the river Meuse, although instead of aiming for Sedan, they planned to cross at the city of Dinant. Rommel's 7th Division would be the first to reach it, and he was so far ahead of the 5th Panzer that one of the panzer regiments of the 5th was subordinated to the 7th to strengthen its move west. A few German motorcycle troops, often the head of the advance, even managed to cross the Meuse on the night of the 12th, although it would not be until the 13th that the rest of the 7th Panzer was ready to make its crossing. Just like further south, the speed with which the German forces advanced caught the French at Dinant completely off guard, and the events of the river crossing would display that very clearly. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Does it ever feel like everybody else has all their stuff together and you don't? So many cool technologies can make that worse. Social media, even podcasts, can make it seem like others have everything together, but they probably don't. That's where BetterHelp can come in. If you've ever considered therapy, it could not be easier than with BetterHelp. All it takes is filling out a brief questionnaire, which BetterHelp uses to match you with a licensed therapist. Then you can change that therapist at any time afterwards for any reason. It's easy, it's convenient, it's flexible, and it removes as many barriers as possible between you and therapy. So stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/WWII today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/WWII.
Some of us love history. Others used to or never did because history was presented as nothing but the rote memorization of names, dates, and facts. Basically, the story got left out, and that made history kind of suck. My name is Greg Jackson. I'm a university professor with a PhD in history, and bringing history to life is my passion. That's why I created my podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. I want to teach you everything you need to know about U.S. history, but I do so through stories. Let me tell you about George Washington begging his men not to mutiny against Congress, Clara Barton saving Union soldiers amid enemy fire, enslaved Frederick Douglass risking his life for liberty, and about so many other figures as their real experiences make industrialization, social movements, and even congressional debates and tax policy come to life. Subscribe to History That Doesn't Suck today, and join me, Professor Greg Jackson, every other week for a new episode, where I'd like to tell you a story.
Over the first 3 days of the German offensive, all along the Ardennes front, the French forces were falling back to the west. This was expected, and in theory they were making their way back to the Meuse River, where they would occupy prepared defensive positions and attempt to stop the German advance in coordination with troops that were already there on the western bank. One important thing to remember is that during these days, the belief among the French military leaders was that this attack was not the primary point of German effort, which they believed was occurring to the north. Now, even a secondary German effort would still be able to push back the French covering forces to the east of the Meuse, and so the fact that the French were being forced to fall back did not necessarily indicate that the German point of primary effort had changed. But there was some worrying information continuing to trickle in from intelligence sources, with some of the more worrying arriving from reconnaissance aircraft that were flying over the Ardennes. An example of this is that during the night of the 11th, a report would arrive from a pilot which reported very large columns of German armor moving through the Ardennes. This report was absolutely correct, and due to the lack of roads in the area, the columns of German armor could be very, very long, and so they were easy to spot. Another aircraft was sent out the next morning, and it would return with its wings riddled with anti-aircraft fire with the exact same reports, including sightings of not just vehicles, but very specifically German medium tanks. A confirmed sighting meant that the report reached the 9th Army's Chief of Intelligence, but he did not believe him. Several more reconnaissance flights were sent out, but none were able to make it over the front and survive, as one of the primary goals of the Luftwaffe during this period was to prevent reconnaissance flights in this area of the front. So the fact that 2 aircraft were able over the course of 12 hours or so to make it over the front, that was pretty exceptional, and the French were not able to replicate that. The German fighters were staging patrols almost all of the daytime hours, just hunting for French aircraft, and so they did a pretty good job. Now, there were 2 armies at threat from this German attack. In the north was the French 9th Army, which was guarding the Meuse north of Sedan, while at Sedan and then to the south was the 5th Army. For both of these armies, they kept receiving some intelligence reports that seemed to indicate that things on their front were more serious than expected, but these warnings generally did not impact the actions of the 2 armies or those higher in French command. There would be a small reaction, though, with the movement of 6 divisions out of the reserve for the Northwest Front, commanded by General Georges. These 6 divisions were given to the 2nd Army Group, which the 5th Army belonged to, and this was really the exact position where they probably needed to be sent. However, it would take time for these forces to arrive, and they were not moving forward with what I would call particular urgency. This meant that they would not arrive at the front in time to be involved in defending the crossings of the river, which would occur on the 13th. Instead, defending those crossings would be the responsibility of the 5th Army with the forces that it had available. The Army had the task of defending roughly 75 kilometers of front, which spanned from the end of the Maginot Line fortifications and then through to the north of Sedan. The commander of the army, General Hunsinger, positioned his forces to best protect the areas that he thought were under the greatest threat, which were not at Sedan. Instead, Hunsinger believed that the Germans would actually attack south of Sedan between the city and the end of the Maginot Line. This area was known as the Stenay Gap. Because he believed that this was the area of greatest risk, it was also where he put his best troops of the 18th Corps. The critical areas around Sedan were guarded by the 10th Corps, while the exact areas where the Germans would attack were defended by the 55th Division. The 55th Division was, well, it was not one of the best divisions of the French army, and it was made up of generally older reservists who had very little recent training or experience. Its officer corps was much the same, but it did at least have the advantage of being in this area of the front since the start of the war. However, when the 55th Division had arrived at Sedan in October 1939, they were not in for a lot of training, but instead a lot of labor duty, because they went to work improving the defenses. Now this, in itself, was okay. They needed to improve the defenses, but they also really needed training. Hunsinger and the commander of the 55th Division, General Lafontaine, put a lot of focus on building defenses instead of training, though. Along the entire 5th Army front, the number of bunkers drastically increased, almost doubling, which was impressive. However, due to the incorrect assumptions about where the German attacks would fall, some of the areas that the Germans would eventually cross over the Meuse at saw the least amount of construction. This meant that while some areas of the 5th Army front had up to 5 concrete bunkers per kilometer, in some areas around Sedan, there was not even 1 bunker per kilometer. In what would be one of the most critical areas just north of Sedan, near the northern side of a bend in the Meuse, sort of north of Sedan, there was a 1.5 kilometer gap with no concrete bunkers at all. Now, of course, bunkers are not the only way to defend an area of the front. Another fantastic option would have been mines. Mines, both anti-tank and anti-personnel, do not get a lot of publicity around their use during the war, but they would be a critical component of defending any area, especially denying area to the enemy. They were fantastic at that, funneling the enemy into specific areas. Unfortunately for the French, there were only a few thousand mines for the entire 5th Army, and only a bit over 400 of those were allotted to the 55th Division's area of the front. And when the German attack came, most of those 400 had not even been placed, so they were kind of useless. All of the focus on building fortifications also greatly reduced the amount of time that the units had for any kind of combat training that was most important for units like the 55th Division, which was made up of reservists. Overall, the 5th Army spent roughly twice as much time doing construction work as it did on training during the phony war period, although this trend did start moving more towards training during the spring of 1940. For example, the 55th Division would begin to send its regiments for a 3-week period of intensive training behind the front in March. This training was desperately needed, but its timing caused some problems. What the French were doing on this area of the front during the spring of 1940 was moving men into and out of the front lines on a company-by-company basis. So a company would spend a certain amount of time in the defenses at the front, and then they would rotate out. They were doing this at the company level, mostly because it made it easier than having to move larger units. The problem was that this put the companies of any given area of the front into kind of a blender, because they weren't moving in from one specific division or one specific regiment. It was just whatever company was available to move in to relieve the one that needed to come off the line. There was little real organization when it came to where regiments or battalions or even their companies were positioned by the time of the German attack. This meant that when the Germans arrived, there were many situations where companies from multiple different regiments would fall under the command of one commander, simply because the battalion, was responsible for that area of the front. This created a lot of friction, which was the last thing that the French army on the Meuse needed, all because it was easier from an administrative perspective to take these pieces and just put them wherever they needed to go at the time that they were needed. All of these issues for the 55th Division would suddenly move from mildly concerning to very threatening when the German forces arrived on the other side of the Meuse on the 12th of May. But panic was not the reaction along the French chain of command. Yes, the Germans had arrived at the river in strength, but it would almost certainly take several days for them to mass the forces required to even attempt to cross the river. This gave the French army plenty of time to respond, and in fact, some reinforcements were already on their way. They were already kind of moving into the area. Over the next several days, those troops would arrive, and more would be dispatched. Then, when the Germans did cross the river, again, only after several days, they would be met by a strong French defense that was already inflicting such losses on the Germans further north. Things were going well there. This was a good plan. No need to panic. Except for the fact that the Germans were not going to wait several days. And on the evening of the 12th, plans were already being made for an attack across the river on May 13th. And that attack will be the subject for next episode.